Good evening, everyone. It's Mark Crowther, chair of the department. We'll get started in just a minute. I'm just letting Zoom merge people in. It's usually a bit of a slow process. I see people coming in right now. So we'll start in a minute or two. I'll do the intros and then we'll get going. All right, so the numbers seem to have stabilized. We'll get started. I'm Mark Crowther, chair of the Department of Medicine. I'm doing this set of grand rounds from home. This is the first set of grand rounds I've moderated from home. Other one has been from my clinic at St. Joe's, I think. So I apologize in advance if I drop. I have kind of tenuous internet at home. The two speakers for today do not require any introduction. It's fitting that they're both on the first chairs grand rounds for the September 2021 season. Dominik Mertz and Zain Chagla have become both media and faculty superstars through the course of COVID. I asked Zain and Dominik how many media appearances they had done since the start of COVID, and Zain ran out of fingers and toes very quickly in describing his experience in the first week. And Dominik said he did only 2% of Zain's, but still probably counts in the hundreds. So they've really been extraordinarily clear, helpful, articulate spokespeople for not only the Faculty of Health Sciences at McMaster University, but also for the disease and in helping people to understand the realities of COVID. And we're now well down in this. I've asked them to do an update on COVID-19, what's new and where we're going, and I'm sure we'll learn an awful lot. The chat function is turned off. If you have a question, please raise it in the question and answer. We will deal with questions that can be dealt with live as we go along. And if there's questions at the end and we have time at the end, I'll open it up for questions. So without further ado, I will turn it over to, I think Zain's going first, might be Dominik. So go ahead.
It will be me starting off. Thanks, Mark, for the introduction. Let's jump into this. So for today, these are the objectives that we aim to cover. I will first talk about the epidemiology, and I will add some global aspects to it because I feel like there's not an awful lot I can tell people nowadays about the epidemiology locally or regionally. And then talk about drivers of COVID-19 transmission. And given that it's September and I'd like to be yelled at from people, I chose a very contentious topic, so I will focus on schools. After that, Zain will talk about therapeutics and vaccines and provide an update what might need to be known about those topics. So, schools. I think first of all, we need to sort of separate perception from data. Perception is outbreaks. Locally, this large outbreak in an Israeli high school last year, and we will come back to this one. France as another example with a large school outbreak back in 2020. There's tons of those reports, obviously. Or then a very surprising newspaper message here that high virus levels are highly likely in schools in the UK, given the high community transmission. Of course, you would expect that. But let's look at the data. I mean, there's no way that I can summarize the data of what's out there around schools in 15 minutes. There's hundreds of studies. What I plan to do, I give you a representative sample of the study designs that are out there, give you an idea in general what the limitations are and what we know based on CDC summaries, our own McMaster group that is looking at those things. So the first type of studies are contact tracing studies. Is an example here out of Wisconsin, and I chose it because of this nice graphic here. So they said in kindergarten to grade 12, when you used masks, relatively small classes, 11 to 20 students, staff maintaining 6 feet distance whenever possible, and using guarantee of the exposures. Over a 13-week period, they only had 7 in-school transmissions among almost 5,000 students, 0 transmissions among staff, and they concluded that with those measures, even in high epi that they had during certain periods of time, they had 0 transmissions to staff or from staff. Another example here, North Carolina, similar conclusion, within school secondary transmission was extremely limited. Then we have ecologic studies. So you would look at incidence rates or positivity rates in your school or student population and compare to the community at large. One example here out of Italy, they labeled it as a cross-sectional and prospective cohort study during their wave 2 or leading into their second wave, using Italian National Reporting System data, more than 8,000 schools, 7.4 million students involved here. Their conclusions were, first, students had a lower incidence than the community at large. On the left-hand side, you see the 6 to 13 years old, and with the exception of Lazio, which is the region around Roma here, where students were overrepresented in terms of incidence rates, they consistently found lower incidence rates in that age group across all the other regions. It's less clear with the 14 to 18-year-olds, but again, trended to have lower incidence rates than the community at large, with some regions again where the students were actually overrepresented. And school staff was overrepresented, regardless of whether it was teaching or non-teaching staff, may be a function of the age group. It's one of the more socially active age groups, but that was one other observation here. Then they conclude there's no clear correlation between schools reopening and community incidents, here showing 8 regions in each of those panels. So in this figure, you have 2 regions, and you clearly know, well, I would say you don't see a clear signal. If there was a clear signal, you would see you open school and your reproductive numbers, so your RT that's listed here, will typically increase in the next weeks to come after reopening. Sometimes it went up, but then went down again. In other regions, it didn't went up at all significantly. So again, no clear correlation, but sometimes you may see something. And then they finally concluded that school-age individuals were not driving this based on the heat map, where it was mostly the young adults, 20 to 40-year-old, and 45 to 49 here in this age group and in this study as well, that had the highest rates first, had the highest peak rates, while the student population was actually lagging behind. Now, those studies come all with a major limitation, which is you need to get tested to be a case for your incidence. And with students trending to have lower severity, more frequently asymptomatic disease, you may not be testing them as much as other populations. One way around is seroprevalence, obviously. A couple of examples for that from the UK, because the UK is I would say, a world leader in terms of the data they accumulate on COVID. So a seroprevalence study after school reopening in the UK, 18 schools, 2,200 participants, half of which were staff. And they looked at seroprevalence among students. Here on the left-hand side, then in the middle you have staff, and on the right-hand side, the community at large for the 6 different regions that were included. And you can see that before school opened on the top here, I added for the community transmission, the red line, you would see, if anything, you had higher staff seroprevalence than in the community at large. So they were overrepresented in terms of having had COVID-19. 3 months later, however, after 3 months of school, that is, things look different. If anything now, suddenly students and staff were at the same or even lower than the community mean in terms of seroprevalence, with the exception of Greater Manchester, where students tended to be overrepresented. So again, no clear picture, I would say. Then another seroprevalence here, where they did repeated serial point prevalence throughout the pandemic. The conclusions here were that they found consistently lower positivity rates in or among students and staff. Here showing three of those groups, primary and secondary school students, then in the community at large. And another limitation that all of the body of evidence, or most of the body of evidence around schools has, is very limited data on Delta. Whatever you throw at people, the feedback is, well, that's before Delta. You have some data on alpha. Most of the studies that I've shown you as well were done in the early days, 2020. So it would have been typically still the wild type, so non-variants of concerns. Some delta data here from England, where they found the lowest seroconversion during the delta wave among staff. And the way you look at this is that from the 5th to the 6th round of point prevalence or seroprevalence, they saw the smallest increase in seropositivity compared to the other rounds before. And that was between the change between June 14th and July 6th. And this is in the setting of more than 70% of the staff vaccinated. So the take home here is, if you have your staff vaccinated and you have a Delta wave, you still see less COVID infections than you would have seen prior to Delta with Alpha or the wild type in the absence of vaccines. Then there's systematic reviews. Again, I just picked one, and I picked out of the wealth of data that you would typically see in a systematic review, the testing positivity in contact tracing studies. So going back to the first study design I showed you here in the systematic review, and I mean, the piece that's very obvious, there's huge heterogeneity here. You have the one extreme, the study by Yon et al. With 0.01% positivity among school contacts, so 1 in 10,000. While on the other hand, you have Stein Samir, who reported on that large Israeli high school outbreak with an attack rate of close to 14%. So you have a huge range, and I think the summary estimate of 2.54 here is pretty irrelevant because there's so much heterogeneity, and some studies done in outbreak settings, other not. But I think the take-home message here is that in the absence of large outbreaks, you typically see very low secondary infection and transmission events at schools, but you can have very significant outbreaks where you are easily in the 4 up to, as presented here, 14% attack rate among the contacts you will be testing. And outbreaks do occur, that's out of question. This is the UK fall term, outbreaks between August 31st and October 18. 25,000 schools have been reopened. They use the same definition of outbreaks that we use, 2 or more cases within 14 days in a classroom, potentially linked. They have close to 1,000 outbreaks. 2% of elementary and 10% of secondary schools have been affected with at least one outbreak. So outbreaks occur. When you look at the student attack rate, again, quite low, 0.8% on the left-hand side here for primary or elementary school, 1.2% in secondary school, much higher for teaching staff, 9.8 and 3.97% respectively, slightly lower and in between students and teaching staff or non-teaching staff, 4.7 and 2.9% respectively. And this is related to those outbreak investigations. And then the large outbreak I mentioned in Israel in May 2020, where only 10 days after school reopening, this major outbreak occurred and probably stopped the reopening ideas of school globally based on this experience. Attack rate was 13.2% among students and 16.6% among staff, so a total of 180 individuals were found to be infected. There was probably a mix of at school and community transmissions. Regardless, the contributing factors that had been discussed was inconsistent masking because of the heat wave that had been ongoing, and only very limited other interventions in place in terms of reducing crowding, social distancing, ventilation, etc. And then we have models. Modeling studies like this one that would compare here country-specific estimates of the reproductive number R with country-specific policies on NPIs, so non-pharmaceutical interventions. And they looked at many things. As I said, I will focus on schools today, but you will see here, if you quickly look through that figure, that for mass gatherings as well as for gatherings, if you ban gatherings of 10 and more people, you see something that looks similar in terms of effect as for school closures. This modeling study here suggested that by introducing school closures, your RT ratio, so your reduction, so to say, in the reproductive number, estimated reproductive number, would be 0.85, so a 15% reduction if you introduce school closures. Once you lift them, it's also associated with a 24% increase in your RT. So how to reconcile all that and summarize? And to start off, I would say this is not necessarily my wording, what I summarize here, and I haven't shown you all the data to back up what I said. CDC has a great summary of a science brief of what's known about school transmission. And then our own group here at McMaster, I'm not part of it, but the NCCMT has a living rapid review. And the last update that I've seen was 17 that looks at transmission at schools and also daycare settings and many other questions. So in summary, I would say COVID activity at schools mirror community transmission. And the one study I didn't show you from the UK suggested that for a 5 in 100,000 cases incidence increase, you see roughly a 72% risk increase in school outbreaks, simply because more cases come into school, so you increase the risk of a transmission event there. Staff-to-staff transmission is more likely than student-to-student or student-to-staff transmissions. There's higher risk of transmission at high school than elementary school. Modeling studies tend to be at odds with the most contact tracing and seroprevalence studies. I think you can reconcile that by the fact that school closures and reopenings are typically not isolated events. So there's co-interventions with other measures that are put in place, which may make the modeling more challenging there when you try to separate the effect of schools. Open schools certainly result in other contacts outside of schools as well. It's also a message to people, hey, things are okay, we can gather, schools are open. And then certainly outbreaks can sort of spill over into your community, obviously, and then increase your community transmission as well. So there's certainly ways how you can reconcile those different signals that you get from different studies. In general, transmission at schools are considered to be lower or as low as in the community, and that schools do not contribute meaningfully to community transmission, at least as long as you have low to moderate community rates and don't have repeated outbreaks happening. And this applies as long as you have preventive measures in place. Now, let's look at community transmission and switch to the epidemiology. So this is the epidemiology in Canada as per today or yesterday. You see that we are still in exponential growth when you're looking at Canada as a whole, mostly driven by the provinces in the West, also Northwest Territories, which are struggling. We only look at 90 cases per week there, but given the small denominator results in high rates here in cases per 100,000 per week. Highest rates currently in Alberta with 230 and Saskatchewan with 223. In the arrows, you see the current RTs, so the reproductive numbers. Highest currently in Manitoba, which is the one province with actually the lowest incidence rates, west to New Brunswick. And we are pretty close to that with our current 34 and an RT value that's just hovering around 1 over the last couple of weeks. That's our epi curve over the last, 1.5 years now. You can see that we've been stable over the last 3 weeks, slightly came down last week. We are similar in terms of case numbers per 100,000 per week as we've been in end of September, beginning of October 2020. When you compare those two curves of the second and the fourth wave, it roughly looks like this, the red line being the fourth wave that we are currently in, and the blue is the second wave. And you can see that we had a steeper slope in the fourth wave, but now we have that plateau phase, which we never really had in the second wave. And this to be determined how this will look like over the weeks to come. In terms of hospital admissions, again, stable over the last 3 weeks after an increase 3 weeks ago, comparable to mid-October 2020. When we look at the more local picture, the Epi here in Hamilton, we had this, whatever that was, wavelet that is now coming down again without, I would say, any major interventions other than continuing to vaccinate people. So the good news is we came down from around 100 cases per day to, I believe today we had 20 reported. So things have certainly improved from that perspective. We are in 7-day average rates similar to where we've been in mid-November. So certainly higher rates than the vast majority of public health units across Ontario, despite that decrease in case numbers that we are currently seeing. This shows you the incidence rate of unlinked cases, so that the metric that we use for our policy decisions across both hospitals here. And you can see that for the first time since we had this increase early August, we are back in what we would use here at the threshold for low epi. This being said, we don't plan to change our policies back to low epi because, well, we expect that it will go up again at some point. The bad news, I would say, from a local perspective is clearly that we had this significant increase in hospital admissions roughly a month ago. Since it remains relatively stable, as you can see here, no decrease either, however, and this is comparable to where we had been sitting in December 2020. And in terms of ICU admissions, as you probably know, even higher than we've been back in December, more comparable to January. All of this being said, at least it looks currently that we have a signal that ICU admissions are going down as well, so fingers crossed. But all of that is quite uninteresting because all we want to know is what's going to happen in the weeks and months to come. And you know the media headlines around the models, which are worst wave and substantial fourth wave, and so on. So the question is, can we, and then what can we expect? And these are the Ontario Science Table predictions for the next few weeks. And as you can see, first and foremost, there's huge uncertainty. They consider everything possible between the green line, which would be based on a 25% decrease in transmission, all the way up to 25% increase in transmission, which would suggest at this point that we would see roughly 3,000 daily cases. Instead, we are sitting at 600 to 700 on average. So pretty much following the best case scenario, at least so far. And that uncertainty obviously isn't unique to Ontario. This is CDC. They are showing on the left-hand side all the models that they have on which they build their consensus model. And these are 25 models. And again, you see a wide range of what had been predicted. The consensus model actually represents pretty much what's currently happening in the US. You can see the epi curve right there. Case numbers were slightly higher in truth than what they had in the consensus model here. The shape looks pretty much the same. So we will see over the next few weeks whether this continues to hold true. This is an example from England, looking at hospital admissions here. And again, you see a wide heterogeneity in terms of what people predicted, from up to 6,000 daily admissions today in the imperial model, down to roughly 1,000 at this point per day in the most optimistic model. And you can see with the crosses here what's actually happening, and they are relatively stable at around 900 admissions per day. Here, obviously, in addition to just the case numbers, the factor that the vaccines have in terms of effect on preventing hospital admission kicks in as well. Which brings us to our ICU model for the province. Again, you see the both scenarios. We still continue to be just below 200, so slightly better than the green line so far. So again, doing quite well compared to what could have happened based on the models. And when we talk about ICU admission, obviously I cannot come around not showing this this slide here, despite the fact that Zain will talk more to the effect of vaccines. But it's clearly not the vaccinated people that block beds in our ICUs. It's first and foremost the unvaccinated, where numbers continue to increase while the number of fully vaccinated remains low, remains stable at a very, very low rate. The Hamilton models I will go over quickly because the latest stats in the public domain that I'm allowed to share today is from more than a month ago. I'm not allowed to share the newly updated ones, but these are the curves that were proposed back then with the peak in December. Now, just adding here in red what actually happened, which certainly wasn't in the playbook, neither the uptick so early nor the coming down after the uptick. Same with hospital admissions. We were predicted to be sitting at 1 hospital admission per day. Mid last week, we were at an average of 5.3. The new models would suggest it shouldn't get much worse, but again, those will be updated on a pretty much weekly basis based on what's actually happening, what's happening with the vaccination rates and so on. So this will remain fluid, but it currently looks like that the peak may be earlier than December. And we will see how that peak will eventually look like for the 4th wave. In terms of mortality, certainly the good news here, other than the worst case scenario, we are looking at much less death than we would have seen in the 3rd wave. Over the last month, despite that peak that we have had, we had 5 deaths only. We would have had many more back in the 3rd wave with the same case numbers. So why is it so difficult to make any predictions? And when you're looking more globally, and I give you just some examples here, you see very different shapes and sizes of Delta waves. Here, Canada, as I already shown you, with based on this table, 69% fully vaccinated, and an Oxford Stringency Index, which is a metric to measure your stringency of public health measures, being quite high with 69%. With an arrow up, which means as a country, we increased our stringency over time, mostly driven by the changes in Alberta, I guess. Then when you look at the most vaccinated country here, Malta, more than 80% fully vaxxed, much lower Oxford Stringency Index. As many other European countries, they saw a peak back in July. Cases came down nicely, doing much better currently than we do, with obviously less measures in place. Denmark, recently the news because they pretty much removed all the public health measures, I believe Friday or Saturday last week, after they had a quite significant increase in case numbers, as you can see, over July and August, and then it nicely came down. Their stringency index currently down to 30%, more than 70% fully vaccinated. Iceland was in the news for a short period of time because of that huge increase in the country with very high vaccination rates again. Hardly any strain on the healthcare system though, and coming down nicely with only very minor interventions and continuing to vaccinate. So again, looks like they have their first Delta wave behind them. The UK continues to be in the news, obviously. They had this significant wave starting or going into July with a peak there, and came down, going up again, may or may not be plateauing at this point of time with a, as you know, or would expect, a low stringency index since their so-called Freedom Day back in early July. But bottom line here was they released many interventions, and the big catastrophe that was predicted did not occur. France had also a peak similar to Portugal and Spain, for example, in July. They introduced vaccination passports just after the peak here that you can see. So very difficult to say to what extent this may or may not have contributed. What they certainly saw, and you still see relatively low vaccination rates compared to the other countries here, planning to do so with the passport had a major impact there on vaccination rates, which we unfortunately haven't seen here in Ontario. The Netherlands was in the media just for a few days because of that huge increase back in July that disappeared as quickly as it came, with only very minor changes to rules around mass gatherings and still a relatively low vaccination rate compared to other countries. And then Israel, which was the world leader in terms of double vax for a long period of time, not anymore, as you can see here. In the midfield in terms of stringency at this point. It looks like they may be plateauing in terms of case numbers. I believe Zain will show you some data on hospital admissions. So the bottom line of what I wanted to show you here is that those epicurves come in different shapes and sizes. And among the most vaccinated Northern Hemisphere countries, of which I gave you some examples, neither vaccination status nor the Oxford Stringency Index can easily predict or in isolation predict the shape and size, which makes it very difficult to predict what's going to happen. And there's obviously other factors that are at play that may overrule the impact of a slightly higher or lower vaccination rate, such as population density, geography, policy versus actual behavior out on the ground, the level of natural immunity on top of vaccine immunity, the heterogeneity in your immunity or in your population with unvaccinated pockets that may be more or less interacting with each other, percentage delta VOCs, the amount of undiagnosed cases. There's so many other factors playing into it, which may explain those different reactions to different interventions and vaccination rates. What do we need to keep things under control going into fall, winter? Vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. And as I mentioned, we unfortunately didn't see a sustained significant uptick in vaccination rates. As you can see here at the bottom, it continues to trend downwards, unfortunately. But that's the single most important measure that we have. And for now, we have to combine that with some level of public health measures. And this is expected to continue over the months to come. Handing over to Zain to talk more about vaccine and therapeutics. Just as my very last message, the simple answers are never the right ones. It's always complex. And if you hear someone telling you all you have to do is X, so Y happens, it's rarely as simple as that. Over to you, Zain.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for that, Dominik. I'm going to try to race through a little bit on novel therapeutics. That's a bit of an update from our prior therapeutic updates and what's in the guidelines, what's kind of coming down the pipeline. And then walk through a little bit about vaccines and boosters and efficacy, as I think that's probably the hot topic of the day. Starting through the process, that we've really focused on this moderate to severe COVID-19. But we are starting to see a lot more work being done on the early end of disease. And again, as we talk about this being a disease of healthcare utilization, where vaccines have largely changed some of that spectrum, the prioritization is really, therapeutic options, particularly in those who are clinically vulnerable, who may not make a vaccine response, as well as, unfortunately, those who aren't vaccinated, where, again, saving healthcare beds is probably, again, a big part of our navigating through the future. So pre-exposure prophylaxis to COVID-19, obviously, the biggest and most cost-effective intervention is vaccines, and probably the top 10 most effective interventions are vaccines. But, we are starting to hear a little bit about monoclonals, and I'll mention them at 3 different phases of infection. But, it may have a role, particularly in people that make a poor vaccine response. And so, this is a large trial that is just published on AstraZeneca's website. So the preprint isn't out there. They did IM injections. It's a double-blind RCT for those who'd had poor vaccine effect or a high risk of COVID exposure. So healthcare workers, major immunocompromised individuals. And they saw a 75% reduction in COVID-19 deaths in the monoclonal group. Their N was not that big. It was a few hundred here. So, take it for a grain of salt. And we know the hospitalization rate in most of these studies is somewhere in the 3 to 5%, depending on how they try to capture this. And so, you probably have even less gains in terms of hospitalization. So, drugs like this that are going to come to the market do have to be reconciled against the fact that, a vaccine makes a polyclonal pre-COVID antibody, which is probably the biggest intervention known. But there are going to be people, for example, on B-cell depleting agents who are getting cytotoxic chemotherapy, who have B-cell malignancies where they may not be able to make an antibody response, or other levels of immunosuppression where preemptive prophylaxis might be a part of the picture moving forward. And so, this is an interesting field that we might hear about, particularly in our major immunocompromised patients. In terms of post-exposure, there's one trial really that's been described to date. And again, this is monoclonal therapy. I'll mention the Regeneron compound a few times as it's been the one studied the most. So there are a number of monoclonals, and again, 2 or 3 of them that really have activity against the Delta variant. So there are, many of the older ones like bamlanivimab, unfortunately, were lost once we saw the variants emerging. This is a trial that was done in the New England Journal that looked at patients, again, that were given to household members within 96 hours of diagnosis. Certainly the incidence of symptomatic infection was markedly reduced. You saw 59 people in the placebo arm versus 11 people in the Regeneron arm, and duration of symptoms, as well as viral load, was reduced in those individuals. And again, there's obviously questions about cost effectiveness here, whether or not this is an important intervention. But, similarly, as we're dealing with nosocomial infections, even in vaccinated cohorts in high-risk populations like long-term care, drugs like this may have a benefit in terms of reducing some of the morbidity and mortality associated with these groups. And similarly, if we were to see a outbreak on an oncology unit or a renal transplant unit, this may be a nice intervention to use to, again, stem some of that morbidity and mortality. In terms of oral early therapy, we're going to talk about monoclonals, oral therapeutics. I am going to hold off on ivermectin just for the sake of time, but talk about fluvoxamine, which is an interesting therapeutic that has a McMaster connection together trial, and then inhaled steroids, which again are starting to come to the forefront, and again a little bit more data to come. This is again the Regeneron compound. This is a trial that's probably the largest trial done of monoclonal antibodies. There's about 4,000 individuals. There is this is a bit of a shifty trial in the sense they give it to a bunch of regular people, and then realizing that there were, all those people don't get hospitalized, and they were trying to look for a hospitalization outcome, as some of the preliminary data had suggested that hospitalization outcomes were actually probably a primary outcome rather than a secondary outcome. They switched to a more high-risk cohort. So it's those over 50, those with other medical issues, so cardiac disease, renal disease, immunosuppression, cancer, diabetes, hypertension, asthma, and high BMI. And they were given, there were people that had COVID-19 within 72 hours of diagnosis, and randomized to drug or placebo within 7 days. You see again a COVID-related hospitalization reduction that is quite significant here. So again, this is a high-risk cohort. Much of this data was done prior to the vaccine era, so mainly alpha and wild-type variant. But you see a 71% reduction in hospitalization and death from 1.3% with the active intervention versus 4.6% with matched placebo. And so again, this is a therapeutic that is actually approved on the Canadian market. There is a supply that's actually in Canada that was meant for this purpose. But there's been a lot of scaling issues and a lot of requirement issues, as well as the optics of obviously offering this to patients. This was again done in an unvaccinated era, and the likelihood is, and as we'll look through the recovery data, is that it probably won't work particularly well in people that have made an immune response to a vaccine or had prior infection. And so again, there is a potential here to mitigate hospital beds amongst unvaccinated individuals. And again, this is probably one that is going to come to the forefront soon. We are working on a plan in Hamilton to try to get this up and running using the assessment centers as a lever point. And again, with the goal to reduce hospital beds, I think this is something that really will be part of the long-term future in terms of mitigating some of the spread of COVID-19, particularly in this mixed vaccine era. This is sotrovimab, which is a GSK compound, similarly looking at hospitalization, smaller trial of about 300 individuals. But again, seeing that risk reduction in hospitalization by a significant degree. So, 7 versus 1%. Again, you're seeing numbers needed to treat in the range of anywhere between 15 and 20, and considering ICU beds, ECMO, all that stuff. It is, again, something to give pause to say, is this is an appropriate intervention to start scaling up, given that, again, hospital beds are a major resource, and again, things are quite stretched. So again, keep tuned to this, and again, this may be part of our therapeutic interventions in Hamilton moving forward. The other drug I want to talk about is fluvoxamine, which is also very interesting. So there was a small phase 2 clinical trial done. And the thought of how this drug works is actually as an early anti-inflammatory compound, and using S1R, which is a inflammatory marker on the endoplasmic reticulum of our immune cells. And modulation in vitro studies with fluvoxamine may lead to lowered cytokine storm. It was a small phase 2 clinical trial. It was done in the United States. People didn't have as much clinical deterioration in terms of shortness of breath, hospitalizations, oxygen, and a saturation of less than 92%. There were 0 patients, again, that experienced this. Obviously, this is a very small trial, and there's a need for further study in populations. And so we have the Together trial, which is a part McMaster. So Dr. Taban, Dr. Mills, and Dr. Guyot, who have been a part of this. This is a multi-platform adaptive randomized placebo-controlled trial that was done primarily in Brazil and I believe South Africa, although this arm was done in Brazil. There is an ivermectin arm as well, and I believe a metformin arm as well. They took fluvoxamine again for 10 days versus placebo. They saw a ED stay in hospitalization of, again, a relative risk reduction of 0.71. Relative risk of hospitalization of 0.71 for fluvoxamine compared to placebo, with a credible interval by Bayesian analysis considered in the significant range, with the number needed to treat of about 24. There wasn't any difference in viral clearance or mortality, although very small numbers. And again, outpatient trials may not be powered for this. There's no difference in time to death, days in hospital, and days ventilated. Again, may just reflect the patients that do make it to hospital, maybe a bit of a different breed at that point. But given this is oral therapy, it's a drug that's widely available, that's off patent, that could be genericized, with a number needed to treat of about 24, there is some pause here to say that this might be another nice adjunct to add to the conversation. There are 2 more clinical trials enrolling, the Active 6 trial, and I believe another trial in the United States. And so, I think if we get multiple trials showing that we see an effect from fluvoxamine, this may be a nice drug to start rolling out, even in assessment centers, to, again, reduce hospitalization amongst those at higher risk, and again, with a minimal side effect profile in some of the safety analysis. Lastly, for outpatient therapy, I want to talk about inhaled steroids. There's 3 trials and 1 that's pending. So the Principal and Stoic trial used budesonide at different doses. Principal used Principal is a nice kind of multi-adaptive platform similar to the recovery and Together trials. They in the UK, they use budesonide in those over the age of 65 or those over the age of 50 with comorbidities versus open label controls. So again, with a grain of salt that people are taking an inhaler, that another group is not taking an inhaler, and so there may be some mitigated placebo effect here. Again, they used a comparator both of people that were not offered any therapies versus people that were in other arms. Again, they noted an increase in self-reported recovery over 3 days, which is over the Bayesian analysis interval. It was about a 2% reduction in hospitalization, which wasn't significant. And so, there might be a little bit of a role here in terms of making people feel better and having something to offer. The STOIC trial used open label budesonide versus no treatment in more general population. So those over the age of 18. And again, the primary endpoint being urgent care ED hospitalization. I wasn't able to break these apart, but from what I gather, it was kind of mixed between all three. So, again, 1 versus 14%, but again, that urgent care and less acute care piece, people who may be taking a puffer might feel like they need less care because they're taking something therapeutic. And so, again, that placebo effect might be there, lower fever and faster symptom resolution too, seen in the STOIC trial. There was a preprint that was actually released yesterday on cyclosinide versus placebo as a multi-center trial in the USA. Again, they took people 12 with over 12 with symptomatic COVID-19, didn't stratify necessarily to people with higher risk of hospitalization. There was no difference in time to symptom resolution by day 30, which is kind of a weird outcome, but of all COVID-19 symptoms, again, kind of a weird outcome measure to power to, considering some of these can be very subjective symptoms. But when they did look at ED and hospitalization, there was again a reduction in ED and hospitalization visits for 1 versus 5.4. And again, this was a dummy controlled placebo. So you might actually start seeing the effects of the therapy a little bit more than the placebo effects of taking a puffer. And so, again, there's no clear symptom resolution benefit, which kind of throws a little bit of a downplay into the study, but you do have some blinded data around less healthcare utilization, even though it was a secondary measure in this study. And so, it does bring up the suggestion that there may be a role here for this medication. There's a large randomized controlled placebo trial, again, with the same drug that's been completed actually in Montreal and Quebec, and the author who I corresponded with doesn't want to put it up on a preprint server, so is trying to get a manuscript into a major journal. And so, I couldn't get anything out of him in terms of the effect, unfortunately. But I think that if you have 2 studies now that do suggest an effect here, it starts to get a burden of evidence suggesting that this might be an effective therapy for some of those outpatients that are just waiting for something to keep them out of hospital, and again, give them some symptom resolution too. In terms of moderate to severe, I'm going to skip over remdesivir, steroids, tocilizumab, and anticoagulation. Anticoagulation, I think probably one of our experts can cover as part of an upcoming round series. I will say there is a new WHO meta-analysis for tocilizumab. Many of us have been trying to use kind of a CRP criteria based on the recovery data and a degree of organ support based on the REMAP CAP data. The WHO meta-analysis of a number of trials, when looking through, may suggest there's a benefit outside of these populations alone. And again, there is a little bit of a question here whether or not we should be expanding tocilizumab criteria. With that being said, our supplies of tocilizumab aren't particularly great globally. So, as much as it might be a nice intervention, we may still have to triage it to the highest yield patients in that sense. I'm going to mention the Regeneron compound here one more time. This was again part of the recovery platform. These were patients that were admitted to hospital requiring oxygen that were randomized to Regeneron again, or versus one of the other platforms within the recovery trial. A lot of these patients were, I think 91% were on corticosteroids at the time. And looking particularly at clinical responses of death and discharge, as well as invasive mechanical ventilation. And you see again this mortality difference of about 6% that is really only seen in seronegative individuals. And in fact, seropositive individuals saw no benefit from therapy. So the overall point estimate was negative in this study. But when you do separate out this relatively large study of seronegative individuals, you do see a mortality benefit emerging. And again, 6% 6%, which is at the same ballpark as we see for tocilizumab and steroids. And so again, this may be also an appropriate intervention for hospitalized inpatients, although verifying that seronegative status is probably reasonable in the concept of trying to triage things out. The discharge alive, again, there was a large range here. So, they did see that there was a higher risk of, higher discharge alive with the Regen compound. And then invasive mechanical ventilation, again, a higher, a lower likelihood of invasive mechanical ventilation if getting the Regeneron compound, and about 7%. So, again, this is a therapy that is available. It's not approved for this purpose in Canada yet. But, again, this is something we probably do need to start considering as supplies get better of this drug, particularly in hospitalized inpatients who are seronegative, unvaccinated. Again, stratifying them and offering them this therapy, even though, again, it goes against some of the basic principles, might be an effective intervention. And it is in the same ballpark as some of our other interventions in that sense. The last thing I wanted to talk about is the JAK2 inhibitors. And this is kind of a field that's been a bit murky over the last little while. There's been a couple of RCTs of small numbers. One, the Khalil trial, and the other, actually, that was the only major one that was published prior. It is small numbers of 500s. And again, looking at observational data as well associated with this, particularly baricitinib, you do see this favor of JAK2 inhibitors in terms of mortality difference amongst individuals. And again, it's a little bit of mixed data, some of it going over the point estimate in that sense. This is the largest trial done to date that was published a couple of weeks ago in the Lancet Respiratory Medicine. And so this was a large study, 101 sites across 12 countries. This was industry sponsored by Eli Lilly, baricitinib versus standard of care. And standard of care was steroids, about 90%, and remdesivir for oxygenate patients. There was no difference in the progression to primary endpoints of progressive organ dysfunction, respiratory dysfunction, and death. But they did see this reduction in all-cause mortality as a secondary outcome. And again, when you tried to stratify it by 28 days in all patients, it was 8 versus 13%. When you tried to stratify it if they required oxygen, because this was any hospitalized patient that could be enrolled, it was 5 versus 15%. You actually see some of this mortality benefit showing up at 60 days. It's a bit hard to consolidate the fact that, you did get more, or similar organ progression to placebo, but you still had this mortality difference in those individuals. But, I think this, does suggest that there is probably some benefit here along with the prior data in trials. And again, where this fits into therapy, I don't think patients should be on steroids, tocilizumab, and baricitinib, but this might be a nice adjunctive compound to replace tocilizumab, particularly if supplies are low. I did an informal poll of some colleagues today, and again, some of them are using them in areas where they don't have great access to tocilizumab. The nice part of also the JAK2 inhibitors is you kind of get rid of the immunosuppression once you stop them versus tocilizumab, where we're kind of stuck on it in that sense. So again, something emerging in that sense. So moving on to vaccines. And again, we talk about expensive monoclonals where we have cheap, widely available vaccines that are proven to be effective. Number one, the big question, and again, as Dominik had mentioned, we're getting a lot of reports that the vaccines aren't working. They are working. And so this is data from April to August of countries going through their Delta wave. And you can see this pretty clear reflection of cases and deaths pretty quickly across Namibia, Tunisia, Malaysia, South Africa, which actually has a slightly higher rate of vaccine now. Malaysia was a little bit abrupted because of some of their vaccine outputs, Zimbabwe and other countries. Again, this is probably underestimated death too amongst them in that sense. And then you see Portugal, Spain, and the UK at the time, which really have these giant waves that are similar, but really not much of a reflection in terms of death, which is, again, the power of these vaccines altogether. And as Dominik showed, even in our modeling. This was data from the US CDC that was actually released a couple of days ago. And this is looking at kind of the vaccine efficacy amongst individuals kind of going to the future. And you can see as the Delta wave hit in the United States, again, this is predominantly in the vaccinated population. There are more breakthrough cases occurring, and there is some suggestion that vaccines might be winning in the United States. I'll talk a little bit about why, but from the most part, hospitalizations and deaths going into July, are reasonable. This was another study that was done amongst a number of hospitals in 9 states, and again, looking at the efficacy against hospitalization, you do see in the 18 to 74-year-old age group that 90% efficacy with a slight interval there, and greater than 75, you do see a little bit of a lower efficacy. And I'll talk a little bit about the data quickly. This is again through a number of VA hospitals in the United States, where you still see that 86%, particularly in younger groups, where they still see a significant benefit over 95%. I'll talk quickly in the next couple of minutes around who breaks through, and again, relatively stable. So, the big question is boosters and who may not have a response to vaccines. This is a study of DMARDs, a couple of studies of DMARDs, and you do see methotrexate TNF inhibitors, IL-17 inhibitors, and IL-23 inhibitors. Methotrexate, again, rituximab, which is clearly an issue, and again, DMARDs, where you may not have neutralization amongst a number of individuals. And this made the provincial criteria today in terms of booster doses in that sense, in order to get these levels up in those populations. The long-term care sector is interesting. This is data from McMaster and Don Bodish's group, looking at long-term care individuals with the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine. But again, you're seeing under the limit of protection, a decent number of cases here in the Pfizer arm, particularly. And again, data out of Toronto, similarly, where you see a decent number without neutralizing antibody levels in that long-term care sector. And again, this probably does justify giving the vaccine to that group. We are, again, this is a little bit into transplant, where we're starting to see, again, some of the issues there. And then hemodialysis is a bit interesting, as this was a study that was done in Toronto, where they looked at dialysis patients. And again, it seems like they do make a response. The last group here is actually the dialysis healthcare workers, but it is a pretty slow response as compared to the general population. Again, given that the increased exposure in this population, particularly as they're in the house for 3 times a week, is there a justification here because of the sluggish response to give a third dose? And certainly you could make that argument. Quickly going through what's happening in Israel, and I have a couple minutes left, so I'll try to blast through this. There are some issues in terms of the rollout. So they're first to get vaxxed, dosing on schedule, predominantly Pfizer vaccine, which I think we're learning is a good vaccine, but probably less efficacious than Moderna. The Delta variant and higher community burdens in less than 12-year-olds and unvaccinated cohorts. And again, this is what started this nationwide third dose campaign. This is the first data from it that suggested you could lower at least test positivity amongst those who got a third dose. And again, the severity data is still very unclear. The one thing I will say is Canada did a good job in terms of spacing out the dose. And you can see here in the study of short versus long dosing of the vaccine between the two arms, you actually see across all the variants, including the beta variant, which is probably the most immune evasive, that antibody levels are well preserved. So again, a good sign that we probably do have a little bit of a biologic difference than Israel as we put people at 8 weeks out. This is a nice Lancet review that took a look at kind of the different variants in terms of vaccine efficacy against both severe disease and any disease, looking at general reports, the actual vaccines, early versus later vaccines, which we obviously see a little bit of a difference here. And again, the variants of concern. And this was actually written by a number of people from the FDA and the World Health Organization, really pushing back and saying, we shouldn't give boosters in really, general population groups in that sense. And the big question is about healthcare workers. This is data out of San Diego, where they saw a rise in infections amongst vaccinated healthcare workers. Interestingly, they didn't see that rise in unvaccinated workers. And there was a lot of question here about how fast this rose, at whether or not this was more exposure based. California had also dropped its mask mandate around the same time, and whether or not there's a lot of confounding here outside of vaccine efficacy that's showing up. Obviously, these discussions are very important as Canada is, you know, world leader, but you know, low-income countries are a fraction of what the world has received. And although we've donated a lot of doses, very few of them have actually ended up in COVAX to go to the rest of the world. I will stop there though, because I think we are probably just at 6 o'clock. And again, you know, the rest of us are going to just talk about is who are the breakthrough cases. The bottom line is the vast majority of them are the people we covered in terms of people that we had low antibody levels for. And again, probably justified for a localized booster.
Thanks, Zain. Yeah, we're at time. Just there's two questions in the thing that I'll ask you if you can just give really quick answers to, because they're both pretty straightforward. So the first is being on methotrexate now an approved indication for a booster?
Yeah, this actually came out today. So NACI said yesterday, and then Ontario had approved this today. The implementation plan isn't there, but methotrexate and DMARDs are now considered a booster indication.
And at least at St. Joe's, I haven't seen the HHS email yet, but St. Joe's sent out an email today with the form that you can actually fill out for that. I would, it doesn't say methotrexate, but I'm sure if you write on it, you'll get some patients who will get their booster, I suspect. And the other one is, what's the dose of Tossie in Ontario right now? 400 or 800 or?
So we did temporarily go back to 800. From what I understand, our supplies are not very good in Ontario because it's a federal asset, and we know another place in Canada that's not going particularly well. And so we may have to drop back down to the 400 dose temporarily while we're dealing with supply issues.
All right. And so both the booster dose, one quick, so you just said it very quickly, but we're not anticipating boosters for otherwise uncompromised patients at any time in the future, particularly since 90% of the world's population is unvaccinated, right?
Yeah, agreed. I think there might be a bit of wiggle room, like absolute age might be now an indication in like, you know, 70 or 80-year-olds. Long-term care for sure. Right now, again, it's transplant, anti-CD20, chemotherapy, and some of these DMARD, HIVs, you know, primary immunodeficiency disorders. But for now, it's really limited to that. Not necessarily going into, you know, high risk, but vaccinated populations like cardiac and diabetic and that type.
Okay, excellent. So that's great, guys. Thanks very much again. This is another tour de force repeat performance. We really appreciate your expertise and the very positive spin you've been putting on this for the world and for Canada and everywhere else, and really become McMaster's front people for this entire pandemic. I think back to Dominik's first rounds that he did now 18 months ago, and the world has changed a lot since that set of rounds held in person at the Juravinsky amphitheater. And wow, what a 18 months we've had. So thanks everybody. These have been recorded. They will be up on the YouTube channel at some point in the next couple of days if people want to look at them. I'd like to thank Dominik and Zain again for just an immense amount of work over the 18 months and really, you know, carrying the torch for McMaster internationally with some really well put together commentary. So thanks so much, guys.